Friction is just one force which just makes everything hard, and it's just there to stop our motion.
What did you say? Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name's Ruhaan Bhargav, and as you probably would have guessed from the title, I'm not very happy. Friction is a very underestimated concept. Normally, we're told that friction is the force which is the reason it's hard to move objects. We regularly perform experiments like the linear air track to ignore the impact of friction on moving objects. I mean, truly the experiment is designed to make concepts like acceleration, constant velocity, momentum, and collisions much clearer and closer to our idealized F is equal to ma and P is equal to mv equations. This leaves a lasting impact on students. I mean, how many times have you been on r/physics memes and have seen memes about ignore air resistance or neglect friction? That might just be me. But anyways, let me tell you why and how friction is extremely interesting and regularly the secret to a magnitude of everyday conveniences. The first records of friction being studied as a formal subject date back to 1493. Surprisingly enough, these records were found very recently in 2016 by a group of British archaeologists in London. And guess what? It was not a scientist you might have expected to have studied friction. It was actually Leonardo da Vinci who studied and formally applied the impact of friction on mechanics and machines he actually designed in his books. Nevertheless, the world had to wait around 200 more years after da Vinci to get publicly introduced to the concept of friction. And this time, this concept was introduced by someone known as, how do I pronounce that one? Amantons. I'm sorry for mispronouncing, but let's continue. Amantons would rediscover these laws, which are now known as the Amantons laws of friction. He believed that friction was primarily the cause of the work which needed to be done for an object to step up from the divots of a rough surface. That really wasn't the true reason why friction exists, and it's not really close to the modern day definition of friction. However, for that to happen, we had to wait about 200 more years until Newton came along and invented, or arguably discovered, his laws of motion. Let's begin with the basics though. Friction is formally defined as the resistance to motion of one object moving relative to another. A very common misconception about friction is that it is an actual force. However, the truth is that it is only modeled as a force, and it doesn't really comply with Newton's definition of a force. Friction is actually caused by electromagnetic forces and a concept known as adhesion between the two objects which are in contact with each other. This is not necessarily something which is important in the mathematical definition of friction. However, it's something which I think needed to be clarified, as a lot of the students just look at the oversimplified, basically Newtonian version of friction and forget the true mechanism behind the thing, and this YouTube channel personally does not allow that. Okay, anyways, nothing wrong with a little oversimplification when it comes to math, as it truly assists us with the calculations and predictions. Overall, there are two main types of friction: static friction and dynamic friction. And before we proceed into the details of these separate kinds of frictions, there are some things which are common amongst both. So let's discuss them first. The first and foremost, Amantons discovered that the ratio between the normal force acting on the object and the frictional force experienced by the object always have a constant ratio, and this ratio is different between different materials. So basically, if you have like a 10-kilogram block of iron on top of a certain type of wood, that will have a different ratio than a 10-kilogram of iron block on top of another iron plate. And this ratio between the different objects now became formally known as the coefficient of friction, and it's now commonly denoted by the letter mu. And since he had discovered this proportional relationship, he devised an equation, and this equation is the famous: the frictional force is equal to the coefficient of friction times the normal force on the object. Basically, F is equal to mu n. Now, this really works with both static and dynamic friction. However, as we'll see in the future, what changes is the coefficient of friction. Static friction refers to the upper limit of the frictional forces which accumulate on an object as applied forces grow while the object is still static. So basically, imagine a box of any weight sitting on a surface. I don't know, imagine a cup of water sitting on your table. Basically, if you apply a very small amount of force, the object does not budge, it does not move. And a lot of the times people believe that static friction is the friction that is being applied on a static object. It truly is the friction which keeps an object stationary. So basically, the more force you apply on the object, the greater the frictional force gets. However, the static friction, the actual value you calculate using F is equal to the coefficient of static friction times the normal force, is the upper limit of that growth. So basically, after you reach that upper limit point, and you apply a little bit more force, the object will finally start feeling acceleration. Now that we have finished discussing static friction, it's time to really understand the basics of kinetic or dynamic friction. Kinetic or dynamic friction refers to the frictional force which acts on an object after it begins motion. Dynamic friction, as understood by scientists, is the force that resists the motion of an object. Going back to our box or cup on table experiment, now that the cup is moving, if the applied force is removed, if your hand pushing the cup is removed, we would expect the cup to keep moving in a constant velocity. However, the static or dynamic friction does not allow that to happen, and it causes the cup to decelerate. And in this context, there is a different coefficient of friction which needs to be used to calculate the frictional forces on the cup while it's in motion. And the equation is the same, F is equal to mu n. However, this time mu is a different number which you can look up in tables, and it's been empirically derived from multiple experiments. So really, all of this sounds extremely confusing if one does not speak about the implications of such a mechanism, right? So let's take a quick look at one of many applications of friction and how friction has like this dual nature in human life. And in this example, we'll be looking at driving. So when driving a car, friction is mainly applied in two ways, one helpful and one harmful. I wouldn't say harmful, one efficient and one inefficient. Firstly, one type of friction is the traction between the wheels and the road, and the other type of friction is the friction between the piston and the cylinder inside your car's engine. So firstly, let's discuss the interaction between the tire of a car and the road. Overall, this interaction is kinetic friction. The moving part, the tire, is interacting with another material, in this case the road. In this case, the friction between the two materials ensures that the tires do not skid and the tires keep on moving. No skidding ensures that the rotation motion provides a push to the car, accelerating the car forward, and it's assisting the motion. So basically, if there was no friction, the tires would just keep on spinning, but since there is nothing to grip on, the car would stay stationary. In this case, friction is helpful, and we want to increase that help to increase the efficiency of our cars. In this case, there are only two methods which are used by engineers to improve this scenario. Basically, we go back to our equation. F is equal to mu n. And in this case, to increase F, you either increase mu or you increase n, or you increase both. Basically, to increase mu, you have to dangle with the material of your tire. Normally, a tire is made of some natural rubber, some synthetic rubber, and some metals. And oftentimes, to increase the mu, these proportions are played with, and a lot of the times most efficient tires have like a little bit more metal than the more inefficient ones. And to increase normal force between the road and the car is rather complicated, since you don't want to add too much weight onto the car, as that would need more energy to accelerate, going back to our conservation of energy principle. However, in order to do this, a lot of the times cars are engineered very aerodynamically, such that when the air passes over the car, it pushes the car down, increasing the weight of the car and therefore increasing the normal force which is being applied to the car, and then increasing the friction between the tire and the road, providing a more efficient drive. Now, in the second case application, the impact of friction inside a car's engine. So basically, a car's engine comprises of multiple metal pistons which are in constant linear motion. So basically, there are tiny little explosions going on inside your car which are pushing some pistons down, and those pistons, by conservation of momentum, are pushing back up, and there's a mechanism under those pistons which convert that linear motion into a rotationary motion which is used to drive your car forward. So basically, there is a very clear energy transfer going on here. So basically, the explosions are caused by gasoline and air, and that's the chemical energy is being converted into linear kinetic energy, which is then being converted into rotational kinetic energy. The main issue here is the fact that the linear energy transformation comes at a cost, because the metal piston and the cylinder are very tightly packed together. When the explosion pushes the piston, it drags across the inside of the cylinder walls, and that causes friction. And as you know, when you rub your hands together, they heat up. The same thing happens inside a car. When the piston interacts with the surface of the cylinder, they heat up and lose energy, therefore losing the chemical energy to heat energy, despite a majority of it being converted into kinetic, which drives your car forward. And a lot of the times this is an efficiency issue, and it impacts the environment, because the more fuel you need to use to drive the car forward, the more fuel you need to take out from the ground, since cars run on petrol and diesel, which are crude oil based organic compounds, and this releases a lot of carbon dioxide and other harmful gases into the air. So basically, in order to increase the efficiency of car engines and reduce the friction between the inner wall of the cylinder and the piston, engineers use what is called a lubricant. So basically, a lubricant refers to any liquid which is in charge of reducing the friction between two solid objects. In this case, the lubricant which is used is known as engine oil, and it's a thick viscous compound which is layered around the pistons, and which increases the smoothness of the interaction between the piston and the cylinder, increase the efficiency of the car, and producing less carbon dioxide and destroying the environment less. And this was basically my rant about how friction is very useful and underestimated concept. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new and interesting about friction and understood the true potential and importance of this concept in our lives. Like, share, and subscribe. Thank you very much. All the resources I used are down in the description below. Peace.